Good morning.
Good morning.
Anybody else want Bud to stay up here and read the other 7,998? I'm game. I'll take a pass. I'm mine. We're going to continue talking about the book of Hebrews this morning and continue talking about the idea of a priest, which, again, I'll confess is kind of foreign territory to us. We don't talk a lot about priesthood or being a priest or what a priest does. It seems like a foreign thing to us from the Old Testament, or if you have a background in maybe Catholicism or Eastern Orthodox faith, you might have an association with the idea of a priest. It's just not terminology we use a lot, except when you're studying the book of Hebrews, where it comes up quite a lot. And for us, we underestimate the importance of the idea of the priesthood to these people and its significance. I was trying to think of some way, some analogy I could use to give you a sense of the importance of the priesthood and who was currently serving as priest to people who lived at that time. And sadly, one occurred to me that I didn't want, but it occurred to me. The person currently serving as high priest at a given moment had all the significance of a presidential election. Okay. The high priest in Jerusalem was not just your spiritual leader. He was definitely that, and we'll talk about that. But he was also a leader of the culture and of the government such as it existed. The Jewish people in the first century don't have a king. Rome is in charge, and Rome manages Judea through governors. But the actual leadership of the Jewish culture and society fell to whoever was currently serving as high priest. And so whoever was in that role dictated the identity of Jewish people everywhere through his choices and behaviors. Okay? So much so that all the politics of the first century Jewish people is tied up in that. The Sadducees that we read about in the New Testament are the people who believe the priests are doing a good job. They are the priesthood. They are kind of well-educated, wealthy, aristocratic people who support the regime of the priesthood as it exists. Out in the country, you have Pharisees who are more rural folks, a populist movement, who are more traditionalist and believe the priests are leading them astray and colluding with Rome and subverting Jewish values. You have another group called the Essenes that we don't talk about in the New Testament. The Essenes are so convinced that the priesthood is corrupt, they withdraw themselves from Jewish society completely and start living in their own communities, not even recognizing the authority of the high priest. Like, that's how big the argument is over the priesthood. So think about that significance and think about what we learn and what we're going through right now in an election year, which I promise is the last thing I want to talk about on a Sunday morning. But the point works. Election years remind us of the fleeting tenure of all leaders. If you love the way the last 4 years have gone or hate the way the last 4 years have gone, something's going to change this year, one way or the other. And then 4 years from now, we're going to do it all over again. And 4 years after that, and 4 years after that. And it's going to change from one regime to the next of how it works out and how it plays out, and even what the topics we're bothered by. The hot button issues in one election may not even be discussed in the next election. The topic swings from every 4 years. And don't get me wrong, as systems go, it's not bad. I mean, I would much prefer this than a tyrant who serves for life, right? There's a reason Churchill said democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. I mean, it's lousy, but it beats the alternative. The worst form of government except for all the others. But election years remind us of the real struggle of having so much invested personally in who leads you, and then having that change over and over again. For Jewish people, again, the problem is magnified. What is one of the principal problems addressed in the Old Testament? It's the question of, how can I stand before God? And who's going to help me do that? It's beautifully stated in Psalm 24, 3 through 6. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false, and does not swear deceitfully, he will receive blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. Such is the generation of those who seek him, and who seek the face of the God of Jacob. Who will go up the hill of the Lord? Who will stand in God's holy place? What kind of person could be in the presence of God? They'd have to be a holy person, a righteous person, an honest person, a person of great character who could stand before God without shame. That's not me. And every Jewish boy and girl knew that. That it wasn't them. They had things they had done that dishonored God. So who will stand in our place? Well, the priest could. And the whole system of the Old Testament, if you read it, big chunks of it are devoted to the idea of the priesthood and keeping him as holy as possible. There's a whole book, the book of Leviticus. The whole book is dedicated to how do we manage the priesthood. Why does that matter? Because that person stands, he goes up in our place to God. He goes up the hill I can't climb. He stands in the holy place I can't stand in. And he stands there on my behalf. So not only is it a political issue, he's running the country in the time of the first century, that he is my representative before God. How invested are you now, if that's his role, in how good a job the high priest does? It's a big deal. Okay? So what are the problems that come with that? What are the practical problems of saying we're going to identify a person who will be our holy figure, who will stand before us in the presence of God? Problem was, yeah, we need a priest, but that priest is going to be a real person. And what are people like? There was a groan from a couple of you. Yeah. What are people like? The first problem is that priests weren't always good people. Just because you got that job didn't mean you were actually a good person. And even if you were a good person when you started, didn't mean you were going to end up that way. You give good people power, and sometimes that goes sideways, and they stop being good people. So the first problem is priests weren't always good people. Let me give you we're going to do a little history this morning because I think it sets the stage for Hebrews and what we want to say. Well, let me give you an example of a real priest in the first century. We read about it in the New Testament. One of the priests mentioned in the New Testament is a guy named Annas. We know him in history as Annas ben Seth. Okay? Ben just means son of. Okay? So he is Annas, the son of Seth. He is high priest from the year 3 to 11 AD. Probably, he is the high priest. You remember the story in Luke when Jesus goes up to the temple at 12 years old? This would have been the guy serving high priest at that time. Okay? This is the guy representing all these religious pilgrims that come up to the temple, including a 12-year-old boy named Jesus. And this fella is going to stand before God. What kind of guy was he? A great, holy, magnificent figure? Our first century Jewish historian Josephus gives us this glowing account. But as for the high priest, Annas, he increased in glory every day, and this to a great degree, and obtained the favor and esteem of the citizens in a signal manner. Oh, he's a great guy. I'm excited. What made him great? For he was a great hoarder up of money. Wait a second. Thought he was a great guy. Well, he was a rich guy. How did he get to be rich? Well, he also had servants who were very wicked, who joined themselves to the boldest sort of the people and went to the thrashing floors and took away the tithes that belonged to the priest by violence, and did not refrain from beating such as would not give them tithes to them. What kind of high priest was Annas? He was a fantastic priest. He brought in all kinds of money. Well, how did he do that? Well, he beat people. Yeah, he would send his goons down to collect your tithes, your free will offering to the Lord. He would collect those by beating you. And what a fine fellow he was. That's the kind of fellow you get. And who's going to tell him not to? He's in charge. So problem one with the priesthood is that the priest might not be a good fellow. Problem two, even if you found a good priest, you didn't get to keep him. I mean, again, that's the issue of election cycles. Either you loved the last one or you hated them, but one way or another, there's going to be another one, right? If you find the perfect presidential candidate, George Washington stands up in his grave and says, I'm ready for another term, and we say, here we go. He gets 4 years or 8 like everybody else, right? You don't, whoever it is, you get that person for a period of time. And even if you can convince yourself, you may think the person you've decided, watch how I do this delicately. You may think the person you've decided to vote for this year is the perfect presidential candidate. You're wrong, but you may think it. Even if you're right, you get a 4-year term out of the deal. That's what you accomplish. Okay? Even if you get the right one, they don't last. And again, if I can do a little history with you, and this will be the nerdy section of the lesson, that's really apparent when you look at the priest of the first century. In my head, I think I'd always thought that a priest was kind of like a Supreme Court justice. They just served a tenure for life. And that was probably the case in the Old Testament. It's not the case in the first century. It's a political office. And it fights all the same challenges of political offices. I told you about Annas ben Seth, who was the high priest from 3 to 11 A.D., He's followed in 11 A.D. for just 5 years by Ishmael ben Fabi. Both of these people were appointed by Gratus and then also removed by the same Roman governor. The governor would put him in place and then remove him. Eleazar ben Annas, and yes, there's a lot of guys named Annas in this list. The first one is Annas, and then everybody else underneath it that says ben Annas is a son of the guy who was high priest at the beginning of the story. So it's this guy and his sons that keep getting put in office. Eleazar served for exactly 1 year, and then he's removed in 17 A.D. Simon ben Camathus served less than a year before he was forcibly removed from office. Joseph ben Caiaphas. Caiaphas is the guy we know from the New Testament. He's the one who's the high priest who tries Jesus. Okay? He is not a son of Annas. Oh, good. He's a son of law of Annas. Oh, well, okay. Still family. And so they take, Annas is still so influential when the trials of Jesus happen, they take him to Annas first. Annas hasn't been high priest for 20 years, but he's the power behind the throne. So they take Jesus to Annas, and he tries him, and then they take him to Caiaphas, and then they take him to Pontius Pilate for the Roman trial. But Caiaphas, as kind of a puppet of Annas, stays in power for a few years till he's replaced 31 A.D. by Jonathan ben Annas, another son of the same guy. He's appointed by Vitellius and then removed by Herod in favor of his brother, Theophilus ben Annas, who's appointed by Herod and then removed by King Agrippa within a year. Simon ben Bilthus serves about 2 years. He gets the job because he's the husband of one of Herod's wives. That's respectable, no question there, right? That's how he gets the job. He later gets divorced from one of Herod's wives, and suddenly he's not high priest anymore. Weird how that works out. They appoint somebody else 2 to 3 year span later. Jonathan ben Annas is yet another son of Annas. He's appointed in 36 A.D., but declines. Says this is a terrible job. No one wants it. And so in the same year, there's 3 different people appointed high priests. Simon ben Bilthus, Jonathan ben Annas, ben Annas, and Matthias ben Annas, who serves just 2 years from 36 to 37 A.D. Everything's good and stable now, right? I've got another slide. 37 to 40 A.D., we're done with all the Annas family, but we're not done with political turmoil. Elianus ben Cantheras serves for a couple of years. Joseph ben Camus is appointed high priest after the death of Agrippa I. Ananias ben Nabadius serves 2 years and then serves briefly for a time later that I wasn't able to track down, but apparently he served again for maybe a month or two. He was killed during unrest in the year 64 AD. Remember that year, because according to your preacher, that's the year the book of Hebrews is written. And it's a year of huge amounts of political turmoil, so much so that a previous high priest is murdered that year in the city of Jerusalem. Ishmael bin Fabi is appointed high priest by Agrippa II. He's arrested by the Romans, sent to Rome, and detained there, and then replaced within a year by another. Joseph bin Simon runs it from 46 to 49 AD. He's appointed by Agrippa II and then removed 3 years later. Annas ben Annas is appointed high priest by Agrippa II. He held the office for 3 whole months, followed by Jesus ben Damnius, who was appointed and then removed a couple of years later, about 6 years later, by Agrippa II. And then Jesus ben Gamla, who's made high priest and then removed by Agrippa II, and is later murdered by the Idumeans. Which leads us, we're almost done with the history, I promise, to Matthias ben Theophilus. Why do we want to talk about him for just a minute? 3 important things about Matthias ben Theophilus. Number 1, he's the high priest in 64 AD, which in principle would be the year the book of Hebrews is written. Okay. Second thing, it might be important. This is a maybe. This is entirely speculative. His name is Theophilus. Okay. If you remember, the book of Luke and Acts are written to someone named Theophilus as an account of the story of Jesus and the early church. We don't know if it's this guy, okay? But there are a few commentators that speculate, what if Luke wrote these accounts with the currently serving high priest in mind? Wouldn't that have been cool? We can't guarantee that. It's a common name. There was somebody else on this list that have that name, so it's not unheard of. But it's an interesting idea. But the third thing, and this is the most important thing about this figure, he is a Roman sympathizer. Why? Because that's how he got to be high priest. You only get to be high priest by either marrying Herod's daughter or being friendly to the people that are in power, the Romans. But at the same time he becomes high priest, the Jewish people revolt against Rome. An organized rebellion against Rome begins in this time period. So what do you do, high priest? You got your job by being faithful to the Romans. The people you're supposed to be ruling are rebelling against the Romans. Matthias decides he is going to be faithful to the Romans. He is a Roman sympathizer. Okay? So think about this. We're reading the book of Hebrews, and it's going to talk about the high priesthood. And there's this immensely unpopular high priest in Jerusalem. How unpopular? In 66 AD, he is murdered by Simon Bar Giora, who's the leader of the Jewish revolt. He says, we're revolting against Rome. We're not going to have a high priest who serves Rome. And so he murders the high priest 2 years after the book of Hebrews is written. Which leads us to the last name I promise I'll give you today, Phannias ben Samuel, who becomes high priest maybe 2 years after the book of Hebrews is written, but is still a story worth noting. Let me ask you this question after I've told you this story. Do you want this job? Remember, the last guy was murdered. Josephus says, here's how we got Phannias. They cast lots, which it should be, the high priest, and it fell upon one whose name was Phannias, a man not only unworthy of the high priesthood, but did not well know what the high priesthood was. Yet did they hail this man without his own consent. That's how bad the system had gotten at this point. They cast lots because nobody with any actual sense or power wants this job. The last guy was murdered. They say, he'll do it. He says, I'll do what? He doesn't know what it is. He's a joke. He does it. When they explain it to him, he says, not me. They say, yes, you. And how does that play out? They also put upon him the sacred garments, and upon every occasion instructed him what he was to do. Here, wear this, stand there. This horrid piece of wickedness was sport and pastime for them, but occasioned the other priest, who at a distance saw their law made a jest of, to shed tears and sorely lament the dissolution of such a sacred dignity. The priesthood had become a joke. And Phinehas is the last high priest. That's where the legacy ends. The story that began with Moses and Aaron and the descendants of Aaron, the legacy of Zadok, the high priest who served David and his son Solomon, that legacy culminates in a joke. 68 AD, the Romans show up and say, this priest thing isn't working out for us anyway. They burn the temple, they end the priesthood, and there is never again a high priest in Jerusalem. That's the story that is reaching its conclusion when the book of Hebrews is written. So again, I ask you, who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? The person that is supposed to represent me before God has become a joke. And even if we put a good one in, someone will murder him in a couple years and we'll be all over it one more time. My spiritual status before God is tied, let me be blunt, to whatever idiot gets elected high priest for the next 2 years. Can you imagine how dysfunctional your spiritual state must be? Even somebody living not in Jerusalem or Judea, but far off, you're a Jewish person living in Italy. But still, you're high priest. You know he's there. He's in the temple. Except every time you get a news report from Jerusalem, it's one more absurdity piled on the list of absurdities. Enter now the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 7, speaking of Jesus, says, but this one, Jesus, was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. If this sounds a little bit like a fantastic political ad, it kind of is. Are you tired of the system of high priests that has come before you? Are you tired of being let down by everybody they put in that seat? Are you tired of dysfunction, corruption, decay, and short-term fixes to a long-term problem? Are you tired of failed high priest? Let me introduce you to someone better. Someone that God made high priest. Not the Romans, not Agrippa, not a governor. He's not a political appointee. God in heaven made him high priest, and he made him high priest forever. What's the message here in Hebrews? Jesus came to accomplish what no other priest could do. He is not just another person claiming the priesthood. He is, in a sense, the only priest who can make that claim. And he is the final priest who will make that claim. See, if you're maybe a Jewish person at that time, you say, this Jesus is nice, but I've got my high priest. Shouldn't I be faithful to the high priest? The author of Hebrews says, you got it backwards. The high priest in Jerusalem, thin ice, short term, lame duck. But this Jesus can be your priest forever. The former priests, this is specifically, it's like he's reading our chart this morning. The former priests were many in number. Why do we have so many? Because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. Why do we have so many high priests? Well, they keep dying. Some of them of old age, but some of them just get murdered. Why do we have so many? They keep dying. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he holds this priesthood permanently because he continues forever. See the irony of that? Why do we keep replacing the high priests? Because they keep getting killed. Who is Jesus? Ironically, someone killed by the high priests. But because of that, he's raised the third day, never to die again. And where death conquered every high priest of the past, this high priest conquered death and never has to be replaced. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. This is not a political appointee. This is not a human with a term limit. This is someone who has now conquered death, has ascended to the temple, not in Jerusalem, but the temple in heaven. And he stands there every day for all of time, acting as your high priest, doing what this person in Jerusalem always wanted to, but never could. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? This man has quite literally done it. And because of that, can save us to the uttermost. You get that? What do you mean? Either saved or not, right? It's like everything the priest did for you was a stopgap measure, a Band-Aid, a short-term solution, a useful fiction. But this man actually accomplishes it, and he never needs a successor. If I could tell you today, and I can't, that I have behind this door over here the perfect presidential candidate who knows the right choice on every issue, who is morally good from top to bottom. You'll never have to be embarrassed by anything he or she says. They are the perfect leader for our nation, and they'll never die. We'll never have to have an election again. We'll put this person in charge, and we can go to work, and we don't have to worry about it. Whatever happens, happens. That guy's going to take care of it, and I never have to think about it again. Who's signing up? Like, I'm down for that. I never have to worry about who's in charge ever again. That's the promise being made in Jesus. This person is just going to do a good job, and they're going to do it forever, and you never have to ask who comes next, because he's permanent and he's perfect. For it is indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. And there, when he talks about holy, innocent, unstained, I don't think he's just making a generic reference to he was a pretty good person, or even that he never sinned. That's all true, but I don't think that's the point. I think he's specifically talking about the story of the priesthood. This man was not engaged in their partisan politics and treachery. Jesus never made a deal with a Roman governor to get put in his position. Jesus never accepted a bribe to become your next high priest. When was the last time we could say that about a national or global leader? That we know as a matter of certainty, this guy was never on the take, never made a deal he couldn't keep, never did anything under the table. Well, that yearning we all have for a real leader, he says it was fitting that we could finally have a leader like this. Someone who is innocent. We don't even ask that question anymore in politics. We ask practical questions. Are their policies good? Can they give good speeches? Do they have the right connections? Are they innocent? Not even a question we ask. It's not a category we care about. This Jesus is blameless. He's the right person for the job. He never engaged in the human politics, the infighting, the treachery and betrayal that had characterized the high priesthood now for a century. He didn't engage in that. How do I know? They killed him because he wouldn't play their game. And then he rose again. He was never engaged in that kind of human machinations. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first of his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. This we'll talk about more in coming lessons, in a future lesson. But the nature of his sacrifice is also different. Leaders typically, not always, I'm not quite that jaded yet, not quite that cynical, but all too often, people rise to power because of what they get out of it. Jesus became a leader because of what he gave. The priest of the Old Testament said, "You bring me your goat, and I'll sacrifice it for you." The priests didn't sacrifice their own goat. Well, they did for their own sins, but not for yours. You provide the sacrifice, I'll help you sacrifice it. Jesus offered himself. Not even something he owned. Himself is the sacrifice he made. He gets nothing out of this that was not already his. He is the only leader that we can ever point to say it was entirely, everything he did is entirely for our benefit and not his own. And he offered, because of that, the last sacrifice we would ever need. The priest, why does a priest make a sacrifice every year? Because it wasn't done yet. We needed another one. The debt wasn't paid. The work wasn't accomplished. Jesus offers himself and actually did what the useful fiction of the Old Testament never accomplished. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priest. But the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. I was laughing with a friend of mine, a former professor. He was asking what I was preaching. I said, well, I'm going to be talking about the election. He goes, oh, that sounds fun. I said, just kidding, I'm talking about Hebrews, which is entirely about the election. He said, how are you going to get the election out of Hebrews? And this is my point. Are you still fretting about your next leader? Are you asking some human being to do what Jesus has already done? That's the question that he's asking them in the first century. Instead of investing all your hopes and dreams in the high priest in Jerusalem, can you recognize that what you actually need, not what you think you need, what you actually need, has been accomplished once and for all time by Jesus Christ? 2,000 years later, we're still looking for some person to put all our hopes and dreams in. And maybe this time around, that person will make everything better and make everything right. They won't be what they've promised. They can't do what they've promised. And even if they did, we'll have to replace them in 4 years. But I'm telling you, there is someone who is innocent, who is righteous, who is good, who is self-sacrificing, who actually accomplished everything we actually needed and has never needed to be replaced. The leader of the free world has been the same man since that day he took his throne in heaven. And anytime we put our affections and our passions and our worry anywhere else, we are missing the point of what he's actually done. We are saying to him, we believe in you, but only to the degree that it doesn't meet the practical realities of my real life. That's when I trust somebody else in an office somewhere. Either he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, or he's not. Either he's the permanent high priest, or he's not. And we've got to start treating him like he is. Would you bow with me in prayer? Father, help us to see your Son as he truly is, and defeat us when we attempt any sad replacement or imitation. Do not let us love the leaders of this world in the way that we love your Son. Help us to submit to him, to honor him, to praise and glorify him, and rest in him complete, with the kingdom in his hands, world without end. Amen.